is Wendell Johnson, and I'm sure you will recognize Professor Johnson's name because he is a famous Iowan in his own right. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Texas and an honors graduate of the university's law school, graduating in 1956. While in law school, he was article editor of the Texas Law Review and was elected to the Order of the Coif and Phi Delta Phi. He is also a member of honorary fraternities Phi Eta Sigma and Phi Sigma Alpha. Following graduation, he served as a law clerk to Judge, now Chief Judge, John R. Brown of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And then he was an assistant to Associate Justice Hugo Black of the U.S. Supreme Court. He then spent 3 years as a member of the University of California School of Law in Berkeley, and following a year as an associate member of the Washington law firm of Covington and Burling, he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to the position of Maritime Administrator in February of 1964. He was admitted to practice in the U.S. Supreme Court and the District of Columbia and Texas courts, and was selected as one of the 10 outstanding young men of 1967 by the USJCs. While at the FCC, he has written about broadcasting and other communications policy issues in articles, testimony, opinions, and speeches. His first book, How to Talk Back to Your Television Set, was published by Atlantic Little Brown in March of 1970, and we're very pleased this morning to have with us Commissioner Nicholas Johnson of the FCC. Will you join me in welcoming him, please?
Thank you, Peter. I hope you can hear me in the hall. If you have any trouble, just raise your hand or indicate in some other way that you want me to talk a little louder. As he points out, as usual, the FCC has difficulty not only maintaining a broadcasting system that will serve the public interest in the United States. We can't even get a public address system to work. But that's part of the reason why an organization like this is so important. I was reading some of William Allen White's writing the other evening, and I came across this passage with which I started off the speech. You employers have wasted 20 years since the end of World War. In those 20 years, a little intelligent self-interest, a little foresight, not much, would have solved equitably the problems that are now pressing upon us, problems that have been adjusted in haste and in the emergency of calamity. By your sloth you created the particular head devil who is mocking you. He is your baby. You begot him 2 decades ago in the days of your youth when you were going to handle your business in your own way, and no man would come into your shop and tell you how to run it. Well, that was written in 1937, and the World War he was talking about was the First World War. But the problem, I would suggest, is very much the same today. And what you are reacting to in large measure is the similar reluctance, often intransigence today on the part of the big business community to react to what are really very legitimate grievances and suggestions and observations and complaints. This group doesn't look very radical to me. And I think that you are typical of consumers around the country, indeed around the world, who are beginning to say enough. And here and there, scattered throughout the business community, are men who are listening and are trying to respond, most of them with efforts that constitute little more than tokenism, because of the institutional pressures upon them. They have the same kind of restraints upon them that you do in whatever organization you're associated with, or I do in the United States government. I mean, I know I would feel quite offended if anyone were to lay upon my shoulders my responsibility for failing to make the FCC work better. I feel that I'm one of 7 commissioners, and I'm writing my dissenting opinions and doing all I can, and I'm sure that some of them feel the same way. And yet the fact remains that we are responsible. We do have to do something about it. And the fact, unfortunately, also remains that there are some in the business community who aren't even trying to make token efforts, who are simply responding with a negative stance and total intransigence. It used to be, when I was growing up in this state, we didn't have an Iowa Consumers League, at least not that I knew of. We just bought our products, and if we had any complaints, we generally made them at home, and occasionally take something back to the shopkeeper where we got it. And I think the fact that today there is an Iowa Consumers League is just another bit of refuting evidence to the theory of so many people in the East that the Middle West is so isolated it doesn't really know what's going on. I think that the facts are just the opposite. Certainly in this area, New York, California, were almost silent about consumer reform. 100 years ago, when Iowa and the other states in this part of the country were setting the stage for what could be thought of as one of the greatest consumer protection movements this country has ever known. And that's the agrarian protest and the populist movement that led to reforms then, like the Interstate Commerce Commission establishment in 1887, the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1892. We're still having difficulty getting the Sherman Antitrust Act enforced, and it's still an equally good document. And even if our fathers and grandfathers didn't think of themselves as consumers, I think their concerns were very similar to those that we have today. I think they too recognize that ultimately it's up to each of us to draw the line against actions by government, industry, or any other large and powerful institution. They believed, as I think you believe, that government should be in the business of protecting citizens from the unchecked power of the irresponsible businessmen, rather than merely rewarding them by giving them government contracts, subsidies, tax breaks, in exchange for what is politely called campaign contributions. Ralph Nader's contribution to this country is really almost impossible to overestimate. I think he's been a tremendous force for good. And I in no way detract from that by pointing out that I think that the consumer movement has, however, really grown out of the protests of individuals. It's developed in every state, every city, where those of us have come to realize that when we don't like what's going on, the answer is not just to complain, but to try to do something about it. Those of you who remember from your high school government courses some of the basic documents of our country, the Declaration of Independence that provided for certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just think about that for a minute. Life and liberty and pursuit of happiness, and how far that is from what government is doing today. One of our principal complaints about our government is the extent to which it's involved in what Dick Barnett has called the economy of death. You can't do anything about your taxes unless you do something about defense spending. And one of the principal missions of our nation's government right now is killing people. And then when somebody like Ralph Nader points out that the automobile is needlessly killing 60,000 people a year who need not be killed, the government is certainly not the one to take up his cause and do something about it. But that's what the Declaration of Independence said it was all about. It said to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So I think we really are getting back to fundamentals. And I think that's healthy, and I think it's sound, and I think you need apologize to no one for it. Because all too often, government and industry leaders will talk about protecting the public and strengthening the free private enterprise system. But all too often, their actions belie what it is they're saying. Iowa farmers know about the shortage of boxcars that comes around at harvest time every year. That was supposed to be the job of the Interstate Commerce Commission that their grandfathers established. Everybody knows how much time his automobile spends in the repair shop and how soon it ends up in the junkyard and the annual slaughter on the highways. Why couldn't the industry have made a safe automobile? I don't know of any objection in the United Auto Workers to that proposal. Everybody knows that the television industry has sorely missed its mark, and that we now have very little more in the primetime offerings of the networks than unsurpassed mediocrity interspersed with offensive commercials. Well, what's the FCC been doing to serve what Congress has called the public interest, convenience, and necessity? What about the importance of free private enterprise when it came to the Lockheed Company? Who supported the rigors of the competitive market then? So we look about for what we can do, and I think one interesting and useful example is found right here in Iowa. Back in 1958, a Republican voter in this state, who was a truck driver, went to the governor, who was then Governor Lovelace, complained about the way that the trucking industry and the Iowa Commerce Commission were combining to hurt the small independent trucker. Now, the Commerce Commission is back in the news these days, but at that time, this Iowan was concerned about the trucking industry. And the governor suggested that he run for the Iowa Commerce Commission. Well, he switched to the Democratic Party, and he did run. And today, that gentleman, Harold Hughes, represents Iowa in the United States Senate and has an almost evangelical national following, which I think is not bad for a boy from Ida Grove who decided to do something about a matter of deep concern to him and other citizens. I think it's difficult as we look back on the development of the consumer movement in the past 5 years, when I think recent attention is focused on it, to separate it really what's been happening in the supermarket from what's been happening in the rest of American life. The battle in the 1960s, early 60s, for civil rights, in the late 60s and 70s for human dignity, the organizing of hundreds of thousands of American citizens protesting the war in Vietnam, the development of alternative lifestyles among many of the young people and some not so young in this country, the efforts of women to throw off the roles and myths that have been foisted upon them by a male-dominated society, the organizing of students to change the curricula in universities and colleges and high schools, especially the movement of young doctors and lawyers and other professionals to assume professional roles that are more suited to protecting than to defeating the rights of private citizens. I think all of these are evidence of a society bent on the exciting and essential process of self-renewal. Raising people's levels of awareness, our capacity to see, to think, to question. As Robert Kennedy used to say, some see that which is and ask why, and I dream of that which is not and ask why not. And I think more and more of us have been doing that in our daily lives, on the job, in our role as consumers, in our role as husband and wives, parents and children, teachers and students. I think that's healthy. Years ago, the ablest law students in this country would flock to the big city corporate law firms That was kind of the natural progression. You'd go to school and make good grades in high school, and then you'd get into a good college, and then you'd be Phi Beta Kappa, and then you go to law school, and you'd be on the law review, and then the next thing you do is you go to a big law firm. I mean, your life's all programmed for you. You don't really have any meaningful choice. And they dedicate themselves to rising to the top of the letterhead while providing a lifetime of top-notch legal skills for major corporations. Meanwhile, the poor and other powerless groups remained largely unprotected in the courts and the marketplace. Generally, the defendants in the lawsuits that these young lawyers were filing on behalf of the corporate plaintiffs. And nowadays, more and more lawyers are taking a different route when they get out of law school. Some are working in the Office of Economic Opportunities Legal Services Program. And many of these have won for the poor, very important constitutional rights. And the poor, as you know, is a category that often includes us as well when it comes to legal rights as well as sometimes economic standing. Some are working in public interest law firms, full-time operations like Ralph Nader's, or in the communications area, a group called Citizens Communication Center, Stern Law Firm in Washington. Legal communes are coming into being in some communities. And others have gone to work for the big law firms, but are demanding that they and other lawyers in the firms be given time off at firm expense to use their skills in working on causes that they can devote more of their enthusiasm to. And I think when an entire generation of young professionals rethinks its life and redirects its energies, that's a very healthy sign in our society. And the same thing, I think it has begun first in the legal profession and has grown perhaps fastest there, but the same thing is true with young doctors, architects, engineers, all professional groups in our society, as everyone's level of awareness is raising. And I think your organization is another example of this kind of a movement in our society. I think it's healthy, I think it's American in the best sense, and I think it will be very constructive. You've decided to work as a group, as a force in the Iowa legislature, watching bills that might formerly have had attention paid to them by no one. There was the one raising consumer credit rates to 18% annually, which you opposed, one providing consumers defense against financial institutions, which you supported. You lobbied for legislation prohibiting used car dealers from turning back the speedometers. And the bill proposing a cooling off period for door-to-door salesmen. Well, I think it's vital that you continue these activities in and out of the legislature. And now I think you're beginning to take a position also, as I understand it, on the new Consumer Protection Agency, a bill now before Congress. Ralph Nader and other advocates have called the bill, co-sponsored by Congressman Rosenthal and Congresswoman O'Dwyer, the most important consumer protection bill ever introduced in the Congress. And as you may know, the Nixon administration is in the forefront of those opposing the bill, lobbying against it, hand in hand with the Grocery Manufacturers Association and the United States Chamber of Commerce, in an effort to gut this bill for a second consecutive year. But what this bill provides, really for the first time, is a staff of consumer advocates, full-time, to participate and initiate actions before the regulatory commissions and administrative agencies. And let me say this to you, because I think it applies, I presume it applies equally in Iowa as it does in Washington, D.C. In the 5 years that I've been at the Federal Communications Commission, I think the one factor that has done more than any other to retard progress of reform has been the absence of everyday, day-to-day representation before that agency by consumer groups. And I think in Washington, at least, that same lack of consumer representation has been documented before every agency. The problem is, you see, that even the most intelligent and independent and well-meaning of officials are very handicapped if the only information they ever get, the only people they ever see, the only briefs that are filed with them, come from those with vested self-economic interests. And that's very largely the case. We'll have a major rulemaking proceeding at the FCC, and there'll be a stack of material that high, filed by the National Association of Broadcasters and the 3 networks and the multiple station owners and the biggest, most powerful television stations in the United States. Well, I'm obliged to read through all that. And there are people being paid $100,000, $200,000 a year to write that stuff, so they better be fairly good at it, and they put their case fairly well. Now, I come to it with a measure of cynicism, and I'm going to check it over very carefully, and so forth and so on, but you're bound to be influenced by it. And then, on the other hand, to be a little, maybe nothing, generally nothing, or maybe a little tiny thing filed by somebody else, see? Well, that's the way policy is made largely. And you've got problems that are worse than that. You've got problems of appointees to agencies who've come out of the industries they're going to regulate and are going to go back into those industries. You've got problems of corruption. You've got all kinds of problems. But I'm saying putting those aside, just dealing with the responsible guys who like to do the right thing, you've got to give them information. You've got to give them the material they need to make those decisions. I would hope that the new chairman of the Iowa Commerce Commission, Mr. Van Nostrand, who's going to be here today, I understand, would make one of his first orders of business, requesting of the Iowa legislature the kind of effective consumer representation before his agency that is essential. If even with this new spirit that he's pledged, he's going to be able to carry out the tremendous responsibilities of that commission. I think it's very important that you get involved in the appointments to these agencies. Whether it's a questionable rate increase or an unwise zoning decision or loose health inspections or shoddy regulation of unethical practices, you've got a very tough battle on your hands if the people there don't think of themselves as public representatives. It's often the case that appointments to federal regulatory commissions will be cleared by the Nixon administration with the industry that is going to be regulated by the appointee to find out if the industry thinks that appointee is all right. Well, whether or not that's appropriate, why shouldn't you at least be a party to the same thing? I mean, they're supposed to be serving you, not the industry. Why can't you at least ask the Nixon administration, and in this state, the governor, for your opportunity to participate in that nomination and selection process for those tremendously important appointments to those agencies? That you want the appointments cleared with you, too, as well as with the industries. All too often there's a problem of former appointees leaving and going with the industry. This is what Ralph Nader has called the deferred bribe. You don't pay the guy anything while he's there, but there's an unwritten understanding if he behaves himself and goes along with the industry, he'll get a fat job when he leaves. Well, there are ways of dealing with that too. A study they did of the Interstate Commerce Commission in Washington showed that of the 11 commissioners, most recently, who had left the ICC, 9 of them ended up working for the transportation industry or the law firms representing the transportation industry. And on a state level, this problem also sometimes prevails. Now, you can simply prohibit that as a matter of law, or you can provide some kind of public compensation for these fellows in exchange for that prohibition, if you wish as well. I want to especially draw your attention to a new force in Iowa, the Iowa Student Public Interest Research Group, known as ICEPIRG, which led to the title of my talk, which is The Tip of the Iceberg. This group is important to you for a number of reasons. One, that I think it can come to constitute a tremendously effective and powerful force for consumer reform in the state of Iowa. So that you ought to know about it and support it, follow its activities, cooperate with it where you can. The second reason why I think it's especially important to you is that you may find in what they are doing a model that you might wish to use for your own organization in rendering it more effective. Last weekend, 100 students from 20 campuses in this state got together to plan this campaign. There's similar campaigns that are now going on across the country. There are already groups set up in the state of Oregon and in Minnesota, and others are now planned for Indiana, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Missouri. Let me tell you something about this group and what they're doing, as I understand it so far. It's an idea inspired by Ralph Nader, but not directed by him. It'd be locally directed. But it's based upon the truth that he has discovered, which is that meaningful consumer action requires more than goodwill, more than meetings, more than newsletters, more than sporadic picketing, more than individual action and not being polluters and being intelligent consumers and so forth. That really meaningful and effective consumer action does require a full-time force of professional people working in your behalf. It requires research. You have to get the facts, even for those things that everybody knows. I mean, when Nader's organization did his study of the Federal Trade Commission, everybody knew the problems at the Federal Trade Commission, or thought they did, but nobody could prove anything. And you can't get reform based on suspicion and rumor and inference. You've got to have facts. And facts take time to uncover, and they take skill to uncover. Legal skill, journalistic skill, digging, research in the library and out in the field, going by the agencies, studying the backgrounds of the appointees, reading the files on the cases, talking to the people who were involved. Now, that does not require highly paid staff necessarily. Ralph Nader pays his people a wage just above the poverty level, $3,500, $4,000 a year, something like that. Some people will require more money, obviously. But all require some to live. The most pathetic thing in the world I confront day after day in my office are young people who come by to see me, who are bright, who are personable, who are dedicated, who are able to participate in reform in this country, and who want to do that with their lives, and who say, look, I don't want to get rich. I don't care how much money I make, but I've got to have some place to live, and I've got to have a minimal amount to buy groceries with. Do you know where I can get some money? And I have to tell them I don't. Because my staff roles are filled. I can't take on anybody more. Citizens Communications Center doesn't have any money to hire people. Ralph Nader doesn't have more money to hire people. And so we take this tremendous resource, because it doesn't take many people to really turn an agency upside down, or get a piece of legislation, or get a business practice stopped. Most of these studies by Nader's groups have been done by 3, 4, 5, 6 people. For a whole agency like the Federal Trade Commission, which has a budget and a staff that is probably a 20% of the entire Iowa government. So you don't need a lot of people, but you do need some. You can't do it with nobody. And you can't do it with your part-time volunteer contribution. As important as that is, you also need that, because you can help in lots of ways. But you've got to have somebody who's in there full-time, professionally trained doing it. And that requires money. And that's the problem that Ralph's been confronting. And he's been just about killing himself, going around the country, making speeches for a fee, none of which he gets, which he plows into this operation. And now what they are doing are setting up these state organizations. And as I understand it, they're asking the students on campus to agree on a referendum that they will make a contribution, $3 a year, less than what they pay for a record album, $3 a year to this organization. They need at least half of the students on a campus to sign up in order to make the thing effective. As I indicated, they've recently had a meeting involving 20 campuses. And then this money will be used by the state group, spent by them, to hire people to work on projects that the students want them to work on. Because what the students have discovered is that mere picketing and demonstrations and so forth are not enough to carry the day either. You need some full-time follow-through.
Agree to a $3 a year contribution to such a fund. Just think what you could do
As an organization, with half a dozen lawyers working on your behalf every day, filing lawsuits, getting information that you're entitled to as a matter of law, but agencies or businesses won't let you have, publicizing the violations of law and the disastrous corporate activity. Just think what that impact could be. I mean, you don't require a cast of thousands to pull this off. A handful of people can do it. And then plugged into the research that the universities can do, the students and the faculty, and the political action that the unions and others can help provide, the full range of use of the media that's available to you, educational campaigns. You can have a tremendous impact on this state. Whether you choose to do it or not is really up to you. But it is possible. I'm going to skip some of this. There is a text which I'll be happy to send you if any of you want to write me. Just Nick Johnson, FCC, Washington, D.C. But I want to save some time for your questions. I think the most important thing to conclude with is just the soundness of what it is you're undertaking here. I think what you stand for, what Ralph Nader stands for, what you're trying to communicate, is that our system can work, that there is viability to a free market with informed consumers, with monopolistic practices curtailed so that people can compete fairly. The small businessman in this state is in a position to do business with the corporate conglomerates. That there is viability and workability in the theory of democratic control of government. That if people are educated and informed by the mass media on the issues, they will react and they can bring pressure on the government. The government will respond if the elected public officials are not so beholden to the largest corporations in the country for their campaign contributions that they can't really vote in your interest. But that's not the fault of the system, that's the fault of the way the system's working. The idea of people getting together and talking over their problems and coming forward with petitions and proposals electing people to represent them, and they're gathering together to pass laws that are enforced and so forth. That's as valid today as it was a couple hundred years ago. It's just that it's not working. And what you're trying to do is make it work better. And I think that there's no point in your continuing to be on the defensive against the onslaught against the consumer movement that is being preached by so many backward representatives of the business community. I think when you're trying to make it work and you're met with hostility and intransigence, it's the big business and government obstructionists who are the ones that are fanning the ashes of despair into the flame of desperation and revolution and violence. It is they who are the ones who are responsible. And don't let them put that burden on you. I think there is no more traitorous posture today, no more traitorous posture than the businessman who preaches free enterprise and then comes to Washington and lobbies against its practice. The trade restrictions, monopoly grants of privilege, subsidies, government contracts, socialized defense sector of our economy. No more traitorous posture than the politician who proudly sports an American flag in his lapel and then suppresses at every opportunity the exercise of the liberties for which it stands. So I think you're on the right track, and I wish you every encouragement, and thank you for your attention and coming out at all on this rainy Saturday morning. And now I would like to take whatever questions you may have in the time that remains to us here. Yes? I'm sorry, I don't know. A former legal assistant of mine was working for her for a couple years when he left me, so I have some contact with that office. But I haven't talked to her in recent months, and I don't know. I'm sorry.
When did she resign?
I don't know. When did your
According to a Pennsylvania paper I received a couple of days ago, she resigned following the Life magazine 17th spread, and the last question in the article was, what because she had become too effective.
I'm sorry, I'm just unfamiliar with it. I don't know. Yes.
One member of the Consumers Committee that organized the fight for power increases in the state of Iowa. And we went down to the Iowa Commerce Commission with 10 questions that we asked the power companies to answer. They never answered. We called them. The Commerce Commission said they would try to get the answers for us. They did not. I'm not saying that they wouldn't cooperate, but they said that these answers should be had through set committees and terminal hearings, which is private citizens who couldn't do. What can we do to force the power companies to answer these questions?
Well, I'd say the answer to that question, as so many others, is you start by having the staff of full-time professional people. Because, I mean, I know in my own experience, it's disgusting, but it's a fact. My wife would have some trouble with a store where they'd given her some faulty merchandise, and she was really entitled to a refund, and they wouldn't give her a refund. And she'd try, and she couldn't get any satisfaction from it. There have been occasions when I've been known to pick up the phone and call a manager and say, hello, I am Mrs. Johnson's attorney, and I would like to talk to you about this matter, and get immediate results. Now, that's disgusting. I mean, a society should not work that way. Big business should be willing to give you your legal rights without your having to get an attorney there to get them for you. But the fact is that often it won't. And that if a businessman knows he's sitting down with a group of consumers and citizens that he can flim-flam, and he's got big expensive lawyers to back him up, he's just going to treat you a lot differently than if he knows that you've got a lawyer there who's just gotten a $100,000 fine out of this corporation, and he's just opened up these files that the agency was trying to keep secret, and he got this federal, this official impeached, and so forth. That lawyer walks in with you, that fellow's going to think twice about refusing to give you information or refusing to answer questions or refusing to give you relief. So you know, I hate to keep coming back to that, but I do think that's the answer to that question or so many others. Because there's always, there's an incredible legal machinery out there that does exist. And a lot of it needs oiling, and it's rusty, and it's covered with cobwebs and stuff like that. But if you can find where is that push to start button, or where is the crank, or where do you plug it in, or whatever, you can often get miraculous results out of the system. Just by moving a little bit over this way and calling your pleading something else, or by filing it in this agency rather than that agency, or by knowing you've got to do something in 20 days or whatnot, you may very well increase your effectiveness 100-fold. Now, it is often helpful for that lawyer to be able to walk in with a group of a dozen of you or 10,000 of you at his back in support of him, so that the fellow that he's talking to realizes not only is he up against first-class legal talent, but he's also up against a populist movement of substantial proportions that is going to involve media, that is going to involve political consequences, and all the other power that we have in our society.
Why can't the Commerce Commission provide with attorney or legal assistance? Very expensive.
They could. That's one of the proposals we've had at the FCC, that we set up a consumer group within the FCC of lawyers. Another proposal would be that they would be funded as, in effect, private attorneys general. That it would be your lawyer, but his fees would be paid for out of state treasury revenues, since he's performing, in effect, a public function. And there is precedent for this, the concept of the private attorney general. So there are a lot of things that you can do like this, but there are some things that you can do better individually, and some things lawyers can do better, some things that you need doctors for, or engineers, or architects, or all kinds of people who are available, they want to help, but they need to be organized. And that requires, I think, a full-time group of people. Yes?
Well, doesn't that just all go back to the fact that our government is supposed to be our representative, and they aren't representing the people? You're reading those big stacks of paper. Why read all of them?
Well, okay. No, you're quite right. There are a lot of reasons for the problem. And one of the reasons is that as we permit the ever-escalating cost of campaigning in our country, we simply permit more and more large corporate control of politics. I remember watching, everything on television is brought to you by somebody. Walk on the Moon, brought to you by the Gulf Oil Company, which led 20% of the people who watched to believe it never happened, that it was just another sort of hoped-up dramatic series. I remember watching the election returns, and it was these election returns are brought to you by some big corporation. I don't remember what it was, and I felt like I do talk back in my television set occasionally. And I felt like saying, yeah, and the candidates themselves were brought to you by our defense subsidiaries, That's a big part of the problem. I mean, if you're going to require these guys to buy television time, and to my knowledge, the United States is the only nation in the world that tolerates a system of selling public office off to the highest bidder by requiring the candidate to have to buy the time on television to talk with his potential constituents about the issues of the day. If the public convenience, interest, necessity means anything, it means that time ought to be made available free for political discourse in our society. But of course, the same guys who are buying that $3 billion worth of time on radio and television, for them, what's another $58 million to buy the political time? I mean, $58 million isn't too much to them. Sounds like a lot to us. But then, to get the United States government in return, it's a pretty good bargain. So that is a big part of the problem. But the other part of the problem, and that is a problem you can address, because one of the things you can push for is free time on television for candidates. Look at the problems of campaign expense in Iowa. How much money needs to be raised to run a statewide campaign in a primary and an election for governor or for senator? How much for a congressman? How much for a legislator? What does that money go for? And what can you do to reduce those costs? Don't just figure out ways that you can tax yourselves to pay for it. That's the solution in Washington, you know. We'll take the money out of the Treasury and give it to the broadcasters for the time. You know, that's one solution. The other solution is requiring them to make the time available free. But address those questions. But what I'm saying is, after you've done that, in addition to that, the government is not something that acts on its own. That's something you have to understand. The government is like a referee. It's like saying that, you know, the referee is there to make it a fair basketball game, and yet the other team always wins. And the referee says, yeah, but you know, you all never send 5 guys out onto court. You just sit around in the stands and you watch and you complain about the fact you always lose, but you never field a team. Or a judge deciding a case. Most of the time you lose, you're losing by default. It's because you haven't shown up. Now, part of the reason you haven't shown up was because you didn't know there was a game on, because nobody told you. But that's part of the problem, too. It also requires a full-time staff. You know, letter writing campaigns can be helpful sometimes, but you've got to know when and on what issue and to whom do you send the letter. All that kind of activity has to be organized. A demonstration at some time is a useful thing to orchestrate. At other times, it's not going to contribute anything. And knowing the difference between those times is terribly important. So this has always been a do-it-yourself nation, a do-it-yourself government. You've got to participate. There's no alternative to that. And if you're not in there, you are going to lose every time. Yes, sir.
I take it you don't think it's possible to turn the regulatory agencies around and be consumer type things you try to do with the FCC?
I don't think I can do it alone, no. And
You think it's possible or not?
yeah, of course I think it's possible. And you know, the FCC has been characterized as the Leaning Tower of Jell-O. The important thing to observe in that characterization is that the FCC is not just subservient to evil pressure. It will respond to pressure from any direction. And it will respond to consumer pressure too, once you get to the point where you come even close to having as much as the guys on the other side. There's a marvelous anecdote that President Roosevelt used to tell about a group that came to visit him. I don't now recall what piece of legislation they wanted, but he listened to them patiently. He said, "You're absolutely right. We must have that law. Now you go out and make it so difficult for me that I have to introduce it." And that's the way the system works. And if you start taking an interest in who the appointees are to your state and county and local jobs, who the party is putting up when the jobs are elective, take an interest in the proceedings that are going on and send representatives there. You read your newspapers more carefully about these proceedings and have representatives there. If you'll set up a group of professional people full-time to go in and represent your interests at the crucial, most important ones, of course you can turn it around. I mean, government will never be any worse nor better than what we make it, what we permit it to become. And if we ignore it, it's going to look just like a garden or a tool shed or anything else that's been ignored. And that's the way it looks today. But that's one reason why it's so much fun to get in there, you know. It's like right after a rain and the weeds are tall and you go in and you just pull out all them weeds, you know. It's a lot easier than when they're short and the ground's dry. And let me tell you, it's rainy and the weeds are tall, and you can go in there and you can clean them out now, and you get a tremendous sense of satisfaction because everywhere you look it's wrong. And anything you do is going to improve it. So it's a great time to get in and have a lot of fun at it, you see. Are you about ready to move on to your next thing? Where do we stand here?
We're getting near that point.
We are. Am I all right? All right. All right. Take one or two more questions if there are, otherwise we're through. Yeah.
What comment do you have
Well, I think it's quite true. I think every president from Washington on has sought to control the mass media. I think every elected official, every dictator throughout the history of mankind has always sought to control the information received by the people. In most countries, you have overt governmental censorship of the media. It's quite clear. Everybody understands it. You print something that the guy doesn't like, off with your head, or you lose your newsprint license. You got to have a license to buy newsprint to have newspapers, something like that. So the desires in this country on the part of politicians to control the press, to control radio and television are just as great as they are in other countries. It's just that we have more protections here against it. But I don't want this to sound partisan, and that's why I've tried to put it in historical context. I mean, I think President Roosevelt used the radio because the newspapers, he felt, were by and large owned by Republican big businessmen who didn't like his policies. And what filtered through the newspapers to the readers of what he wanted to say didn't satisfy him. So he went to radio to avoid that problem. President Kennedy was very conscious of his effectiveness in using the live press conference and used it to great effect. President Johnson was certainly quite conscious of what television was doing to him and tried to do what he could to control it. So I don't mean this in a partisan sense at all, but I do think that I would be irresponsible if I did not point out that I think this country is under a greater threat today than ever before in its history of executive domination of the mass media in general and television in particular. This is a problem in terms of the party in power, whatever that party may be. It is a problem in terms of the executive compared with what are supposed to be three equal branches of government. I think the Congress is a very useful institution. I think it is much closer to the people than the executive branch. And I think that the Congress is being rendered more and more ineffective with every passing month by the inherent power of the executive on television. He's personified. He's a single individual. The president can walk in and demand prime time whenever he wants on all three networks, and his message comes to you. No comment about it, no criticism of it, no questions being asked of him. It's time he controls. He gets it the time of night he wants. He gets it on the night he wants. He controls the content entirely. He says anything he wants to. He uses any visual props he wants to. No one else in our society can do that. And not only can he control time, but he can make news. I mean, goodness knows, I certainly don't oppose improving relations with Red China. But I do think it is only candid to note that the principal thrust and impact of that visit is a television program. That was the way it was announced, and that's the way it will be executed. And everyone has accepted at the outset that nothing will come from that meeting. That's been made very clear to the American people. There will be no great new treaties or changes of a relationship or anything. It's going to be a visit. But that is fantastic television. I mean, I'm saying from a producer's point of view. It's beautiful. Now, first of all, you can't get equal time to answer that. But even if you could get equal time to answer it, you'd be on only one network instead of three networks, and in a time period you didn't control. But you can't get that either. But even if you could, what do you do to follow that act? I'm serious. And what you will see in 1972 is an incredible succession of television spectaculars brought to you by the Republican Party. And I think that you ought to be alert to that. I think you ought to be aware of that. I think you ought to know that that's what's going on and that's what's coming. And that's a problem that we've got to wrestle with at the FCC. And it doesn't help, obviously, to have a majority of the members appointed by the president. So there you have it. But I think the responsibility very largely goes back to the media. What do they do? What do they do when Agnew criticizes the network commentators? I'll tell you what they do. They fail to cover live the largest collection of people ever gathered in Washington, D.C. to protest anything, the largest accumulation of talent ever available to a network for free on 3 days after Agnew's speech. What do they do when President Nixon says, we'd like to divert the American people's attention from the problems of the cities and of war and race relations and inflation and unemployment? We'd like for them to think about marijuana a lot. And will those of you who prepare primetime entertainment shows please put in skits about marijuana? What do? They all come to Washington, they sit in the White House, they say, yes, Mr. President, and they go back to Hollywood, and for what Variety called one of the first times that propaganda device had ever been used, the television network falls in line behind the president and does the shows he wants. What do when Herb Klein calls up, says, I'd like to go on your late night talk show? Or calls up Dick Cavett and says, we don't want this spokesman for the SST on, we want this spokesman for the SST on. What did ABC do? They put on Herb Klein's spokesman. What do when ABC Sports was going to cover the Buffalo Holy Cross game, where at the halftime students were going to sing songs about peace and this land is your land and other radical ideas like that? ABC Sports refuses to cover the halftime. Too controversial. A few weeks later, Army-Navy halftime, Joint Chiefs of Staff come out and give us a few little pep talk on behalf of war. That's fine, that's carried. Now, that's what's happening to you. And that's what's going to continue to happen next year. As Agnew and Mrs. Mitchell shows up on Laugh-In. Seriously, I mean, you know, these are not accidents. The producer of the show had spent time with Nixon prior to that. And that's what's going on news, even the public service announcements. You know, send a letter to North Vietnam to get back the prisoners of war. What a cynical, diabolical thing that was. That's a public service announcement. That's also a thing that the White House controls. So yes, there is a very real problem, but the answer in part is for the media simply to stand up and tell it like it is. Tell the American people what's going on. Talk about the pressure. That's the way you deal with that problem. In England, the Prime Minister has the power to censor anything that he wants off the BBC. It fell my unfortunate lot to explain that to Harold Wilson once. I thought he knew it. It turned out nobody ever told him before. And I was standing there with some BBC people who never have forgiven me to this day. And I said, you know, what would happen if you ever were to do that? He said, well, I suppose they'd go on the BBC and say, we were going to present an announcement about this and that and the other, but the Prime Minister, exercising his power of censorship, was prohibiting us from saying it. But that's the way you deal with it if you're as powerful as something like CBS. You put on the selling of the Pentagon. And when they protest, you put it on again out of fairness. That's the way you deal with the problem. And whether the media will fight back remains to be seen, because historically they have been in favor of power, whoever holds it, and without regard to a political party or race, creed, or color. So that's where we stand, folks. And now I hope with the rest of your conference you'll solve all these problems for us. So when I read the Iowa papers, I'll hear about your great successes over the months to come. Thank you very much.
You haven't spoken about cable television.
Well,
what's the social impact? Do you have a minute to say something about cable television?
okay, but then that really will have to be the last. Cable television holds a prospect of democratizing the media in a way that no nation has ever known in history. If you understand it, if you will fight for your rights, if you know what the issues are, if you will get the right kind of franchise agreements drawn up in your cities. If you don't, it's going to go down the drain like every other technological innovation and be used for nothing but corporate profiteering. The point is, broadcasting has always been, up to now, what we call an economy of scarcity. There are only so many frequencies that you can have in Des Moines for television stations. And when those are taken, there aren't any more. Nobody else can get on the air. With cable, there is no limit. Every one of you, if you want to, can have your own television station. Every one of you, if you want to, can go use a channel on a cable television system, 1 hour a year or 1 hour a day or whatever. All right? Now, that's what the technology offers to you. It offers you the possibility of having, in effect, a contract carriage system, where anyone who walks into that cable television office can demand a channel at any hour, pay the price, put on his program. Whether it will in fact develop that way depends upon you. You can put in now, there are businessmen who've made business decisions that they want to put in 60-channel systems, and not in the biggest cities in the United States. Now, will you have 12-channel systems, 20-channel systems, 30, 40, 60? How many channels are you going to have? Because if you end up getting nothing more than the television stuff you've got over the air now, what have you gained? As a fellow once said when asked if he was going to subscribe to cable television, he said, "Why should I?" He said, "Out where I live, we pay to have the garbage hauled out, not to have it hauled in." But this can open up channels. You could have a 24-hour program channel for preschool children, or grade school children, or high school. You could have material going into all different classrooms at different times, different material. You have adult training programs, or a special channel for doctors, and all kinds of things you can have. You know, if you'll get into it and take a stand on it, I would suggest it'd be a very appropriate issue for you to give some attention to.
This really is up to the individual citizens on the franchise voting to see that this is done prior to the time they get the franchise, am I right?
That's right. The terms of the franchise govern what are the obligations of the company. And the city councils grant the franchises. And it's, in general, you need to check and find out exactly what the procedure is in Iowa. Okay, thank you very much. Wish you well.